Welcome to the Elegant Warrior, Siobhan McHale, and I cannot wait to talk to you about the hive mind at work.
I'm looking forward to it, Heather.
So I have a thing about bees. I just love them. I
Mhm.
think they are phenomenal. I do not have a lot of experience with bees like you do, but for the listener, tell them a little bit about why the hive mind and bees are a big part of your focus.
Yes, well, my focus is all about helping people to lead and manage change. And this passion for change came about growing up in Ireland as a child. I became fascinated by the bees as they swarmed in the orchard of my family's farm. And this fascination with human ecosystems or natural ecosystems translated into my career spent researching human ecosystems or groups, and how groups behave is often very different, Heather, to how individuals behave. We can
Mm.
see one set of behaviors in individuals and another set of behaviors in groups. So the bees and this fascination with how they embark on change, I think we can learn a lot from that. So I use the examples of the beehives in The Hive Mind at Work, my latest book.
It's so good. As you can probably hear, my dog is barking in the background. I don't know if you can hear that on your end, but I'm like, oh my goodness, bees and dogs, we have no control over them, but bees are a little bit more predictable than dogs are. And so I'm ready to give him a bop. I think it's really interesting. I have been studying storytelling intensely for the last few months. And there's a lot of talk about metaphor and how metaphor really helps people to learn and understand. And for me, the metaphor of bees throughout your book really helped me to understand the way you approach group dynamics and the way that you approach change. And I think it's important before we get into the 9 laws of group dynamics and the lens, which I love, to sort of talk about the credibility piece. You applied this idea of the hive mind to the Australian and New Zealand banking group to great success. So tell the listeners about that before we dive into the specifics of it.
Yeah, so the ANZ Bank in Australia, headquartered in Australia, was when I joined the worst performing bank in the country. And 7 years later, after a remarkable turnaround, it became the number one bank in the country and actually the top performing bank on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So this remarkable turnaround was brought about by actually applying some of the principles in the Hive lens, which I talk about in the book. So one of the first things we did was to see the reality, see the big pattern that was running the organization, and then go about rewiring that pattern. So that was really important work right at the beginning.
So good. And it really shows that these laws of group dynamics and the lens model that they work, that it does apply. So the 9 laws of group dynamics, I want to go through them, at least touch upon all 9 of them, because for the listener, we've got listeners and some of them are leaders who need to make change, and others have families, which is another group that has its own dynamics. But no matter the
Yes.
size of the group, this all applies, right?
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter what type of ecosystem that you're dealing with. Ecosystems, whether they could be financial systems or climate systems or countries or organizations or teams, cultures, they are paradoxical because on the one hand, they are complex, but on the other hand, if you understand the rules or patterns that underpin these groups or ecosystems, then you have the keys to unlocking change.
So good. And one of those group dynamics, one of those laws is patterns. And you just mentioned patterns.
Yes.
And in the book, you gave the example of the dance that bees do. Tell the listeners about that group dynamic, the patterns.
So the patterns, and if I go back to the ANZ example, when I walked into the organization, the leaders were very deflated because they had just undergone a restructure, which had taken the organization backwards. But what they hadn't seen and dealt with was the big pattern running the organization, which was the order taker pattern. Head office was in role of order giver, giving the directions to the 700 bank branches who were in the role of order taker essentially. And the pattern running the organization, which was going around and round, was you take orders from corporate essentially. That was leaking energy from the organization and causing customer service to be at an all-time low. You've got to see the pattern, intervene there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this idea of patterns. Once I read about it, I can see it in the organizations that I work in. You can see it in politics. You can see it in almost anything once you know about
Yes.
these laws. And the same is true, and I think all of the laws. I one of the laws that I think was really important to me, and it's also similar to the things that I talk about in my work, is it's law number 4, multiple perspectives. And you talk about it in terms of the bees. The drones have a different perspective on what's to be done and what the world looks like than the worker does, than the queen does. So tell us a little bit about that law as it applies to change in an organization.
Yeah, I think in complex ecosystems, you must understand the perspectives of the different parts of the ecosystem. Otherwise, you are intervening and you are facing into something that you don't understand. The more that you can understand the perspectives, the less likely you are to encounter resistance or when the ecosystem pushes back on you. So you must understand what I call the you never step into the same river twice, and different
Mm.
parts of that river will be reacting in different ways. So that's really important. And also you can harness those multiple perspectives during change if you're able to access what people are thinking.
Yeah, one of the things that you talk about in the book is the ability to unite those perspectives and to get them all
Yes.
on the same page, and the importance of that, which I thought was just absolutely amazing. I also liked number 8, which was the law of unintended consequences. And in talking about that, you talked about pesticides, which after you talk about this, I do want to talk about bees and pesticides for a minute. But can you tell the listener about how pesticides have impacted bees and how that sort of illustrates this law of unintended consequences?
Yeah, so often when we embark on change, we're putting in interventions into the system which have this ripple effect, these unintended consequences which we don't anticipate. An example in the bee community was with the growth in urban centres and the growth in the human population, the need to feed this growing population led to an exponential increase in food growth or crop growth and the use of pesticides. But that had a ripple effect on the bee community and this colony collapse disorder, which happened, which decimated and led to large percentage decreases in the bee population. So this unintended consequences, we see it everywhere during change. We think, oh, we'll just prod the ecosystem in this way or push it in that way. And the ecosystem or group responds, it reacts, it is not an inanimate object. We've often been taught that organizations are like machines, and we pull this lever, we tweak this widget, we all that ratchet, but actually they're much more like ecosystems than machines, obviously, but that's the lens we've been taught to see through.
Yeah, and it's that unintended consequences law also connects, no pun intended, to the connectedness law and this whole idea of the
Yes.
ripple effect that you just mentioned. It's interesting, Siobhan. I read it, I think it was yesterday, and I don't know where I read it, but there's a new study that shows that queen bees are actually now drawn to the dirt that has the most pesticides in it. Did you see this?
I
It's
didn't see that
it's like it
study.
was just like
That's
yesterday. There it
amazing.
was. I've got to go and see where I found it. I'll put a link to it in the show notes and I'll send it to you when we're done. But I thought that that was interesting that as we adapt
Yes.
and change, it sort of becomes something that the queen seems to be drawn to rather than repelled by. And it really kind of plays into some of the things that you talk about in the book as well. So I'll send you that article because I think you'll find it
Yes,
interesting.
please.
You in the book, after you go through the 9 laws of group dynamics, you talk about the lens approach. And I love a good acronym because it helps me to remember things. And it's the way that you have approached change, knowing the laws of group dynamics. Can you talk about what the lens stands for and sort of just talk us through each of those?
Sure. So we've got to look through a different lens when we're looking at organizations, and this lens has to be more systemic. So we have a hyper individualized world where, a lot of the books that have been published are about the individual, and that's fantastic. But on top of that, we've got to add in not just IQ and EQ, but GQ, group intelligence, the ability to intervene successfully and bring about change in groups. So this Hive lens that I talk about gives leaders the four stages that they embark on when you're going through change in groups. The first stage is look beyond. You need to look beyond to see what's really happening and the patterns that are running your group that you're often caught by and that are often invisible to you. The second stage is to experiment. Complex, adaptive ecosystems are unpredictable, and you must experiment to often emerge the solutions. The third stage on the lens is the N, which is to nudge the ecosystem, not push, not shove, nudge gently and see what emerges. And then the fourth step on the lens is strengthen. Often I see leaders who put in interventions and then they switch the go button or the go live button and then they leave and they don't check in, they don't strengthen the change. They just make the assumption that we launched it and it must be going well. You must strengthen the emerging change.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense just as you lay it out, but also as you go through so many examples of companies and you have such great stories. As I mentioned earlier, getting into storytelling more and more. And you have so many great stories of companies that sort of have gone through, used this lens to make change or not used it and have
Mm.
done so at their peril, which I think is a phenomenal example as well. You talk about yeah, there's so much in the book. I mean, I'm looking at my notes now. There's just so many, it's very juicy. There's a lot that a leader can learn from the book. And I think it takes more than one read through to really get all of the juice, if not many read throughs, to get the juice out of it. But one of the things, and I think when it's in the part where you're talking about looking beyond, you say that you have to understand the current reality before you make
Yes.
change. Tell us why that's so important.
Yeah, I think many of us are under pressure in organizations. We're under pressure from our managers, from our exec team, from our boards to make change happen and make it happen
That's
fast.
it.
And we think our role as leaders is to be decisive and to move forward quickly, but actually, that often takes you down the wrong path. And I give an example in the book of a manager who was under pressure to increase customer satisfaction in an infrastructure company. And she was about to go and buy a whole fleet of new trucks and new equipment because the equipment she believed was old, and this was leading to bad customer feedback. But when I went and visited some of the sites, I discovered a very different problem, which was that, on one of the sites, for example, the manager told me we're falling behind in laying infrastructure cable for internet, for the provision of internet cable for the locals. And I said, well, what's causing the delay? And he said, oh, we're having trouble getting through the white quartz rock in this old gold mining area. And I said, but when you did the proposal, did you not see that there was white quartz rock in this region? He said, yeah, we should have, but we just didn't see it and we didn't plan for it. We don't have the jumbo drills in order to get through it quickly enough. So this was a pattern in all of their projects, this reactive pattern
Mm.
where the project leaders weren't planning, the site managers were reactively trying to work backwards from that and bring in extra crew in order to solve the problem. The extra crew were the firefighters or the people, the heroes coming in to save the day. And this reactive pattern, we react rather than plan ahead, was running the organization. And that's what they needed to rewire rather than the technical solution of let's buy new equipment.
Right. And it really, one of the things you talk about that really connects with that is the idea that those working closest to the work are the best problem solvers. So like in that situation, actually as the leader to actually talk to the people, it goes back to the law of the multiple perspectives, to talk to the drones and the worker bees and to make sure that everybody understands so that you can actually create a real understanding of the reality and not just your understanding of the reality.
Exactly, because often, like that manager is sitting in head office thinking, "Oh, the problem is we need equipment, new equipment." But when you go out, talk to the site managers, talk to the different parts of the ecosystem, that's when you begin to discover what role are the different parts in. So the project managers were in role of reactive thinkers, the site managers were in role of reactive doers, and then the firefighters were being brought in to help save the day. And this
Mm.
perfectly created, co-created pattern was running the organization. And you had to see that pattern. And once the manager saw that pattern, she could start to work on rewiring it. And she actually established a steering committee which would review proposals and start to anticipate more for these risks, to see the white quartz rock before you actually started the project, and to order the jumbo drills in plenty of time.
So good. You talk about three mistakes bees don't make, which I loved that part of the book. And one of those mistakes is failing to live the group's values. I work with organizations and we talk about this a lot because I think that there's a lot of talk these days about having your value statement and knowing your values and putting them up on the wall, but actually
Yes.
living the values is challenging and a huge mistake if you don't. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I call it the walk the talk pattern. And if you don't walk the talk, very quickly you lose credibility as a leader. And the important thing to do, I think, is to look at key decisions or all decisions through the lens of your values. Does this stack up against those values? If we make this decision, how does it stack up against? And sometimes those values may be competing against each other, but rather than being implicit, make it explicit. The what and the how, what we're doing, but how we're planning to do it, and how does that stack up to our espoused values? Because that's when you start to lose all credibility, trust is eroded, and you just see engagement start to plummet.
Yeah, it's such a great part of the book, and all three of the mistakes that bees don't make are really important mistakes that I think every organization needs to be aware of, so that they're not blind to. So everybody listening needs to get the book so that you will tease the other two, so that you don't have to you'll have to
Yeah.
read it to hear them. But I do want to talk about the four leadership roles: the delivery leader, the performance coach, business strategist, and change leader. Tell the listener, if they're a leader and everyone's leading something, right? But tell the listener how it is that they're supposed to play. Is it possible to play all four? Do they play each one at a different time? Should they tap in a different leader for each of these roles? Explain a little bit more to us about how those four interplay with one another.
Yeah, and this goes back to one of the laws, which is the law of role. And often, as managers or leaders, we have been taught that our personality dictates our behavior, but actually, our role influences our behavior in a way that is just as powerful as personality. And if I give you just a quick example of, let's say, Grace, who's a co-owner of a company, and she goes into her warehouse in San Francisco one morning to discover that the warehouse is flooded by an overnight storm. And she's quite an introverted co-founder of this business. But that morning, she steps into role of crisis manager, issuing instructions to her team to call the insurance company, switch off the electricity, remove the boxes that have become wet overnight from the storm. And as she drives home after cleaning up the warehouse and getting it up and running that evening, she thinks to herself, wow, thank goodness that you can reframe your role and to influence your actions and behaviors. It's not just dictated by the fact that I'm quite introverted and shy. I stepped into role of crisis responder. And we can do that every day, to step into critical roles that leaders are required to step into. And it all depends on your mental map.
Mm-hmm.
Mental maps are your GPS, and you can change your mental map of your role to create faster behavior change with less noise.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that sort of leads me into, because mental maps become stories, right? And you talk about,
Yes.
in the book, you talk about swarm and how to create a swarm. And you talk about storytelling and symbols. And I loved that part of the book because if we as leaders or even individuals who are leading within our, or as not in a leadership position necessarily, but want to lead or want to create change, stories and symbols are a good way to create a swarm of people behind you supporting you. Talk a little bit about those two and how they play a role in creating a swarm.
Yeah, so stories and symbols bypass often the logic parts of the brain, and they hit the brain in a deeper place than the cortex. So they are very sticky, if you like. They are heard in a different way, and they can influence people in a different way. They can mobilize a group to change, but it has to be the right story and it has to be the right symbol.
Yeah.
And there are lots of examples in the book of leaders who are very intentional about the stories that they tell and the symbols that they choose for their change. But they are remarkable change accelerators if you get those right.
So good. It's so good. And I love the visual of the swarm. I also loved, I recently read a book about ritual. So it was fresh in my
Yeah.
mind. And then you talk in the book about rituals and the importance of rituals, especially in times of change. And I loved the story that I did not know about the palace beekeeper.
Oh,
Tell
yeah.
the listeners that story and why ritual is so important when we're talking about making change.
Yeah, rituals are incredibly powerful because they start to strengthen the emerging change. So that is the S on the Hive lens, this strengthening of this change muscle and embedding of the new ways. And yeah, the ritual in England actually it emerged where when a member of the family died, the ritual was that you would go and you would tell the bees
Yeah.
because the bees are the member of the family, and this happened very recently when Queen Elizabeth II in England passed away, and her beekeeper went to each of her sites where she kept the bees and basically told the Queen told the bees that the Queen was dead, but the new king would look after them. And the story goes, or the mythology goes, that if you didn't, then the hive would leave. The bees would
Mm-hmm.
abandon the hives, and you wouldn't get honey. So, yeah, that ritual is really fascinating of telling the bees.
Yeah, and I loved that because that ritual also sort of it's communication. It's the ritual of it, but it's also communicating what has happened to the bees, of course.
Mm.
But to make change happen in order to get those multiple perspectives or to create the connectedness or to know the roles as you go through your 9 laws of group dynamics, you can see that through line of communication that allows the laws to actually work. And through your book, there's that through line, and especially in the stories that you tell of communication. What is your hope when a leader reads this book and walks away? What is your hope that they will do with the information that they have learned from reading and digesting the book?
Yeah, my hope is that they start to build their group intelligence.
Yeah.
And that is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. I think we have been taught to see the world through IQ,
Yes.
intellectual intelligence. So that helps us with logic, reasoning, critical thinking. Very important. And then we have the work of Daniel Goldman, which was around emotional intelligence or EQ. Again, very important. This interpersonal realm where you
Mm-hmm.
understand your own emotions, you understand the emotions of another individual. But those two intelligences are necessary, but not sufficient for the complexity that we are facing into in the business world today. We need to develop group intelligence, which is the ability to understand and intervene in complex human ecosystems. This is the systemic lens that's missing. And it takes a while to rewire your brain. And this is why when people read the book, they go, oh my goodness, this is so obvious. But it wasn't it wasn't clear to me until I read the book because we haven't been taught how to put on this systemic lens, this systemic pair
Yes.
of glasses.
Yeah, I truly believe your name will be just as Daniel Goleman's name is synonymous with EQ, emotional intelligence. I do think that your name will be synonymous with GQ, and I do hope that people start to see that a group, any group, is its own sort of entity that needs to be considered in that way. And I love the bee analogy as a means to do that. I loved the book. The subtitle, Harnessing the Power of the Group Intelligence to Create Meaningful and Lasting Change, really is what you can learn to do if you dive into some of the ideas in the book. So it's phenomenal. Everyone, there'll be a link to read the book, to buy the book in the show notes, not to read it, you have to buy it. And we also will link to some of your answers to the last three questions. The first question is about you. We talk a lot about believing here and things that we believe, and we're always working on believing new things. What is something that you are just starting to believe or that you're working on believing right now in your life, Siobhan?
Yeah, it's funny when you write a book and you put it out there and then you start to believe even more in its power. So for me, the power of group intelligence, I'm even more a believer in that now that I'm seeing the reactions and seeing how people are applying these tools and the need for this more systemic lens. So that's my belief, is that we can truly understand complex human ecosystems, understand their hidden patterns and intervene powerfully in them, then we can create a better world.
So
So,
good. And you're getting some
yeah.
great evidence of that as people read the book, I'm sure. So supporting that belief with all of the positive feedback for the book is phenomenal. Other than your own, what book would you recommend to the listeners?
Wow, so many good books. I love John Cotter's work. He's always been a mentor of mine. So, Our Iceberg is Melting is a wonderful book about change.
Very
Always
good.
recommend John Cotter's work.
Fabulous. We will put a link to that in the show notes. And then the last question is my favorite question. Your answer to this question will be added to the Elegant Warrior Spotify playlist. What is your theme song? What is the song that you would want to have playing as you walk onto the stage of life?
Oh, wow. Um, Maybe The Eye of the Tiger.
I
It's
love it.
it's just such a rocking song. It gets your energy up and pumping before you do anything. I just love that. I just love the energy of that.
So good. And you are in Australia, so I will not say have a good night. I will say have a great day. Siobhan, thank you so much for coming on and for writing such an interesting, unusual, thought provoking book. It's really phenomenal.
Thank you, Heather, for having me on the podcast and for your feedback on the book. I really appreciate it.